Okay, it's a nice sunny and mild Sunday, November the 16th, and this is the meeting of the Alberta Camera Club Alliance, and our guest presenter is Alister Benn. We'll give him the microphone in a couple of minutes. I just got a couple of slides to show just to introduce people and just talk about a couple of things for the ACCA. So give me a second here while I share my screen. And just for everybody's information, so the Alberta Camera Club Alliance was started back in pandemic days, 2020, and has evolved over the last 5 years. We now have 15 member clubs. Our Cochrane Camera Club is just joining us. And actually, that is every camera club in Alberta that I'm aware of. Unfortunately, the Calgary Camera Club folded, but their members are being absorbed by Foothills Camera Club and other clubs. So we actually have 15 clubs now with a little over 1,000 members. And what do we do? The main thing is that we, through our joint resources, we sponsor 2 or 3 major speakers during the year. These are high-end, very prestigious speakers such as Alister, whose expertise and experience and skills command a higher fee than what many of us can afford on our own. But by combining efforts, we can sponsor them. And these are the 3 speakers this year, and I'm pretty excited. We went through a process with the Alliance to determine which photographers to invite. So Alister is the first one, and then coming up in about a month's time is Joel Robeson. And then so Alister is in the UK. Joel Robeson is a Canadian who's now living in the UK. And then John Marriott, who most of you probably know, is in BC, and he's well known for his work with wildlife, and he's going to be presenting on the Kootenai wolves. And so what else do? We get together a couple times a year by Zoom to trade notes and ideas about how to run a camera club. We share information, speakers and judges. There's an opportunity for members of one club to attend other clubs' meetings. That's up to each club whether they want to allow that or not. And so it gives an opportunity to see some speakers and presenters and photo work that you may not be used to seeing. We've talked about having in-person get-togethers, and Old's Image Seekers hosted one this past September when they went out to Yahatinda Ranch and the Bighorn Falls. And that's something we'll look to do again next summer or fall. And the other thing we do is last year was the first time we had an evening celebrating Alberta photographers and photography, where members from all the clubs submitted short presentations. And that went over really well, and we'll look to do that again probably in May. And just a quick heads up about Joel Robeson. And so he's going to be presenting on December 14th. And again, so he's in the UK. So again, we'll be doing this on a weekend afternoon at 2 p.m. And he does these very whimsical artwork / photography. And I'm really interested to see what he has to say, because I just love his work. And then, and that's it. So just the next slide then. So talking about Alister. So I'll just read a short précis about Alister, and then I'll turn it over to him, and he can. And then Alister, you can talk a bit about yourself and your work and how you developed your current presentation. And but I will just say a little bit about you, as soon as I can find my message here. So he's a member of the FRPS. He's a well-respected international landscape photographer, writer, and educator. He's led workshops around the world, publishes multiple best-selling ebooks, and has built a global audience through his YouTube channel and writing. And so what he's going to be talking on today is a bit different, but when I saw his work on his website, I said, yeah, this is exactly what I want to hear. And so rather than focus on the technical aspects of how cameras work and capture images and how to process that, so he's going to take more of a reflective and inspiring approach to photography. And he's going to introduce the expressive forces that shape our images: luminosity, contrast, color, geometry, and atmosphere. So not as technical checklists, but as gateways to mood, connection, and meaning. And at its core lies the idea of finding a visual compass, a way of navigating creativity that frees us from comparison and performance and instead anchors us in clarity, intent, and authentic expression. So, that aside, I'll turn over to Alister. You're welcome to share your screen and start talk. And so, for those of you who just joined the call lately, so we're going to take a break about halfway through, just a short break for refreshments and whatever. And that opportunity, so at the end of the first half, and then again at the end of the presentation for questions. But one thing you can do, we can have a little bit fun here. So on the bottom of your screen where you have the bar with access to the Zoom widgets and tools, one of them is labeled React. And if you click on React, you have access to a whole bunch of reactions, such as thumbs up, heart, clapping. So feel free to do that when you see a wonderful image. Just jump in there, and we can entertain while we're doing this. There we go. So people are
we're
having
keeping
fun with this.
score.
And without further ado, then I'll turn over to Alister and take us away on a journey.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I always get very self-conscious when people are introducing me purely because I know me quite well, and yes, I guess I do have a philosophical take on photography, and that's really after 25 years of being involved in photography and thinking about it at quite a deep level. I am quite a thinker, and I get a lot of fun from doing that. Now, one of the things I'm actually just going to, I need to get rid of me. I don't want to see me in all of this carry on. Let me just hold on 1 second. I just want to turn off my video so that I can just focus on doing this thing without staring at myself in the. Okay. So let's just go back. Right. So, yes, once again, thank you very much for the introduction. So, yes, understanding the landscape, finding your visual compass. And what I want to share with you tonight is something really quite deeply personal. It's a way of thinking about photography and life, for that matter, that's evolved quite slowly over the last 25 years. It is less about the results and the rules, and it's more about something quieter, something deeper, and how we find ourselves in the landscapes that we photograph. I'm sure all of us picked up cameras to get out into nature, to be in the landscape. And so many of us find ourselves unhappy or dissatisfied with our work, and we're always striving to try and achieve something better. And really, the purpose of this talk and all of the teaching that I do is really to understand that the photographs are a byproduct of a better relationship in the landscape. They're not the purpose of being in the landscape. So, this talk isn't about teaching or technique. It's about connection, about rediscovering that inner compass that helps us to navigate both the outer world and the world within. At the end of the day, photography really isn't rocket science. My personal philosophy has always been pretty simple. Point your camera at the cool stuff and eliminate everything that isn't cool. And it's really simple, and that's what I do. I will describe each photograph to help you to understand what you're looking at and where. This one's obviously a landscape. It's a little bit more obvious than some that will follow. So this is on the south coast of Iceland in winter. It's a place called Eagle Rock. Very famous location, but I really like this one. It's really stark, very minimalistic, and as we're coming to winter, it felt quite appropriate. So my approach to photography is not particularly profound, but it's served me well over the years. Simple, direct, and efficient, the perfect Scottish philosophy. For a long time, though, I was just repeating what other people told me was cool. Quite often, I would go to all the famous locations, point my camera at the famous scenes, because, that's what I thought landscape photographers did, and I thought that's all that we did. I was photographing what I thought I was supposed to, the icons, the crowd pleasers, the formulaic sunrises. And I would say that my compositions were neat and my exposures were pretty good. but my awareness wasn't always fully engaged. I'm sure that many of you will know where this is. I am speaking to an Alberta group. So, yeah, Mount Assiniboine, not actually in Alberta, in BC, but near enough. And this was the first morning I met Adam Gibbs. And it was taken about 12 years ago now, this photograph. Stunning, stunning place, which I truly love, even though it's in BC. Um, it took me years to realize that what's truly cool isn't always defined by popularity or expectation. It's what resonates with you, what pulls at your attention and won't let go. And that's where awareness begins. Your photographic awareness begins when you actually just start photographing what you think is cool. Another photograph of Mount Assiniboine, this time only reflection, and this time flipped upside down. So we're still giving the impression of looking at Mount Assiniboine, but we're actually looking at the reflection of Mount Assiniboine. So it's easy to recreate someone else's vision, to imitate a style, a mood, a formula that we know works. But at some point, if you stay on that path long enough, you begin to feel something is missing, a kind of a hollowness, a quiet discomfort, perhaps. And that's the moment when real photography begins, when you actually witness your own copying or your own lack of originality. And I've been through this, the only reason I can talk about these things is because I've been through this phase of just knowing that I'm just copying other people's work and I'm not really truly creating my own work. And those two words, like me, are everything. So, how to photograph like me. And they're a challenge. That mirror and a compass. So, what does like me even mean? What does it look like, sound like, feel like? To make photographs like me is to stop performing and to start listening. It's to let go of how you think you should see and to begin noticing what actually moves you. It's not about style or trend or belonging, it's about resonance, about recognizing yourself in your work. And that's when the camera stops becoming a tool for imitation and becomes a bridge between who you are and the world that reflects it back to you. This is a macro photograph of the surface of a small stream on the north coast of Spain, where I run workshops fairly regularly. I'm just back from there, actually. I got back on Thursday night to Scotland. And this photograph was taken on a blue sky day in the middle of May, in the middle of the afternoon. The light wasn't super spectacular, but the way the light was reflecting off the stones off the bottom of the river and the little bit of blue sky and the ripples, and then using a macro lens has created this really quite cosmological photograph where I guess we would know it's water, but you're really not terribly sure. And this is the type of thing I like to photograph, photographing things that could be taken in a stream running through someone's backyard. I'm not necessarily driven these days by kind of iconic locations. So, for those of you who don't know who me is, um, superficially, I'm Alister Benn. I have a passion for two things: desserts, the larger and the stickier, the better, which is why I'm not as skinny as I used to be, perhaps. And my second passion is playing guitar. At the last count, there were eight of them in my studio. I am having a four out, one in process going on right now. I've just bought myself a really beautiful guitar. So yeah, I'm downsizing the number of guitars that I have. But each of them brings out a different side of who I am, different tones, moods, and fragments of my expression. It's a guitar thing for sure, but it's also a creative thing. Just like how different focal lengths let us interpret the landscape in different ways, each guitar gives me a new language for emotion. Some are gentle and meditative, others demand to be loud, raw, and unrestrained. Together, they remind me that there's no single way to express truth, only different instruments for saying what needs to be said. So those two words, like me, echo through everything I do, whether it's playing guitar or photographing or writing or poetry, dance even. So the questions that follow, they're the questions that follow us through life. Expression and art are answers to the triggers and the experiences that we have as we travel through life. So, how do I play guitar like me and not like David Gilmour or Jimmy Page or Jeff Beck? How do I talk like me, love like me, exist like me? I sound like Baloo the bear out of the Jungle Book. Um, because performance isn't the same as creativity. One looks outward, seeking for applause, and the other looks inward, seeking truth. And somewhere between those two, in that space between imitation and authenticity, that's where art and life really begin. So people often assume that professional photographers spend all their time out there making photographs, chasing light, climbing hills, or standing in rivers at ungodly hours of the morning, getting chased by bears. But the truth is, I spend far more of my time thinking about those two little words, like me, than I do pressing the shutter button. I've just come back from 2 weeks in the north coast of Spain and I made 106 images in 2 weeks because I spend more of my time looking and thinking, and I only press the shutter when the landscape whispers yes. That's the way I photograph. It's the only time I photograph is when there's a connection and there's something I want to say, or it triggers a train of thought in my mind. So how do I run a business like me? How do I teach like me? How do I keep my work true when everything around me is pushing towards trends, algorithms, and noise? You mentioned at the start my YouTube channel. I've actually only published one YouTube video in the last 12 months because I had to take a break. I was sick and tired of being on a hamster's wheel, trying to compete with every other YouTuber for views and, you know, meeting the needs of sponsors. And I gave up all my sponsorships this time last year because I wanted to be free. And this is why when I'm running my business like me, it means I have to be authentic. And it's not easy, and authenticity rarely is easy. But I've learned that when we build a life around your own values, not somebody else's expectations, the work begins to take on a different kind of depth. It becomes less about achievement and more about alignment. And that is who I am. So when people say, "Who is Alister Benn?" I would hope that they would say, well, he's a very authentic, sincere, creative person. Um, I think, you know, if that could be my legacy, then I'd be quite happy with that. Photography has taken me to some extraordinary places around the world, from the Himalayas to the deserts of the Gobi. But home is on the Isle of Lewis, out there on the far northwestern edge of Scotland, a place where the wind and sea rule the day, where silence still has weight, and where the landscape seems to think for you when you've run out of any thoughts that you may be struggling to have. It's there among the gneiss rocks and the Atlantic storms that I find clarity, where I can return to those same two words and ask once again, am I still creating like me? So the Outer Hebrides are a place of restless skies and shifting light, a landscape that never shows the same face twice. It's become both my home and my teacher. Here, the land and the weather remind you of your place in things. You don't control nature, you learn to listen to it. The wind has opinions, the sea changes its mind every 5 minutes, and the light, well, the light has moods. It's from this rhythm of uncertainty and revelation that expressive photography was born. A small company that I run with my wonderful and beautiful wife, Anne Christine. Um, and it began with a simple question. How can we make images that feel true to the land and to ourselves? This is a sea stack just down the road. That, for scale, just to give you an idea, is about 60 to 70 meters high. It's a pretty big thing. The hole is probably 30 meters high. Um, and yeah, I get to go down there fairly regularly. It's just down the road from where I live. And every time I go, it's different. It's a truly wonderful place to be. So that question becomes our compass, and it shaped not only how we photograph, but how we teach, write, and share. For me, that's what matters the most: authenticity, honesty, and integrity. Creating work that reflects who we are, not who we think we should be. delivering genuine value to those who trust us enough to learn from what we make. And why? Because, well, that too is like me. It's not a slogan, it's a promise, a way of being in the world, creatively and personally. This photograph was taken in just up the road in Banff. It was taken, I can't remember the name of the canyon. There's a canyon just on the parkway heading up towards the Icefield Parkway, and there's a you go down a hill and there's a little river and a gorge and stuff, and that was just taken in there. And I really just love how geometric it is. You know, you've got the rock wall on the left-hand side, and then the shadow from the wall on the right is creating this quite zigzaggy triangle um, and sort of zigzaggy shapes and stuff, and just the energy of the water. This is what attracts my attention. I live just a few miles up the road from the Callanish Standing Stones. Um, if any of you have been in the Outer Hebrides, you may well have visited Callanish. And I've stood among these stones in every light imaginable. I've even been there in the morning for a wedding when the groom was so hungover that he was late, and it was his bride's dream to get married at sunrise at Callanish, and he was late. And I don't know if they're still married. But in the moonlit. I've been there under the full moon. I've been there under auroras. I've been there in storms, and obviously, like here, with the first fire of dawn. And every time I feel the same presence. These stones were raised nearly 5,000 years ago, and yet the questions they hold are still the ones we ask today. Who am I? Why am I here? Where do I belong? What endures when everything else fades? How do I find meaning in the face of the finite life and constant change? The tools have changed, the people have changed, but the longing hasn't. And these stones are proof that the desire to understand, to see, is ancient. And that's what we're still doing. Each time we raise a camera to our eye, we're continuing the same human tradition, trying to make sense of our place in the world. And that's the extraordinary thing about these questions. They never get old because we never outgrow them. Understanding the landscape isn't about geography or geology, it's about relationships. The way we stand within the world and the way the world reflects back what's already inside us. There's an old question to the, or there's, sorry, there's an old answer to the question, how do I make more interesting photographs? And the cheeky answer is, well, you should become a more interesting person. And it might be funny, but it is also true. The more things that you are fascinated by, the more things you have to be fascinated by that you will point your camera at. So when I really began to listen and not just look, I realized the landscape was never silent. It was always speaking. I just hadn't been still enough to hear it. To put it more directly, in order to hear the landscape whisper, you have to shut up and listen. When we begin to unearth who we really are, when we stop shouting or demanding attention and actually stop performing, that is when we have a chance. And this is why I formed our company, Expressive Photography, to marry the relationships between art and craft, the existential and the metaphorical, the literal and the imaginary. Because photography at its best is both poetry and precision, a dialogue between what we feel and what we can describe. It's where the tools of craft serve the questions of art, and together they lead us closer to meaning. This shot is the Scottish definition of drive-by shooting. Um, you have a slightly different one south of the border where you are. But yeah, literally driving along a road in a snowstorm, looked out the window, saw this tree up on the hill above me, dived out the car, ran up the slope of the hill beside me, and took a couple of frames just as the snow was getting heavier. I had a pop-up flash on this old, I don't know, kind of some old Nikon camera with a pop-up flash, and it just reflected the bokeh of these snowdrops, snowfalls. So yeah, this is a very Scottish image, and this is the point that craft is only the way to articulate feel. Craft alone is not going to take you to creativity. It's about knowing that craft is a means to an end. So, technique gives us control, but the expression gives us meaning. Without both, something is missing. That said, you only need the amount of technique necessary to express yourself, much like knowing every word in the dictionary but having nothing to say. Mastery for its own sake can only become another trap, a way to hide behind competence rather than reach for vulnerability. Technique should serve emotion, not replace it. The goal is not perfection, but presence, to make photographs that breathe, not just impress. So, no image exists before it has been seen, imagined, and created. The world waits patiently for us to notice, to listen, to acknowledge, and to respond. Every photograph begins not in the camera, but in the awareness. That fleeting instant when something in the outer world touches something in the inner one, and the two briefly align. How improbable is it that in a universe some 14 billion years old, that I should exist at this moment, conscious, seeing, able to translate a sliver of this vastness into a still frame and share it with you? The odds are unfathomable, yet here we are, witnesses to light, to change, to the quiet conversation between chaos and beauty. This image that I am showing on the screen now, is it just me or does it look like a whale's eye? It's just a little rock pool on the island of Harris, which is our southern neighbour. Um, just an innocent little rock pool in amongst the rocks. But when I saw it, I just thought it was an eye of a whale. Um, and when you point your camera at it, you're isolating it from everything else that's in your field of vision at that moment in time, and you're creating a composition. And creating compositions is what photographers do. Compositions don't exist until you see it, until you acknowledge it, until you raise your camera, decide on your focal length, decide on your depth of field, decide on how you want to process the image and how you want to present the image, what aspect ratio you want to use. So all of these infinite number of little choices that we make allow me to show this image to you. And it only exists because I took it. So I think that's pretty amazing that we get to do that. And I think if more people really valued how important our photography actually is in a world that has billions of photographs in it, each one of them still pretty special. So, yes, I count myself very fortunate. I get to travel the world, mostly teaching, guiding others as they learn to see. And in between those moments when the noise falls away and the world reveals its subtleties, I still make a few photographs of my own. Small gestures of gratitude to a universe that continues to astonish me. I do occasionally make a photo or two. Uh, I do run workshops most of the time. This was a workshop, actually walking out to that arch that we looked at a few minutes ago, a workshop maybe a couple of years ago. And in the winter, the sheep are always looking for food. Everyone who walks through that bit of the coast, the sheep just follow you, thinking that you've got pockets full of sheep feed. This is one of the guys who was on the workshop with all his little friends. I really like this. I really love that guy. He's such a sweet guy. He's about 6'6" and has got the most gentle speaking voice. Pardon me. So the truth is, I travel so much that I only ever process a fraction of the images I make. My Lightroom catalog is like a sheepdog that's lost control of the flock. Images everywhere, none where they're supposed to be, but all destined for something. Maybe a Harris tweed jumper. But there's one thing I know for sure. I was completely present when I made each and every one of them. Even this one, surrounded by an audience who are clearly more interested in my friend than they were me. It's not glamorous, it's not curated, it's real. And this is what a day in the life of a landscape photographer actually looks like. And honestly, I wouldn't change it for anything. So, your time in the field has to stand alone as a wonderful, worthwhile experience. Of all the places you could be, of all the things you could be doing, you chose this to stand in the wind, the rain, the silence with a camera in your hand. And that choice matters. It speaks of curiosity, of reverence, of the part of you that still believes in wonder. Don't measure that moment by how many keepers you came home with. Measure it by how deeply you felt alive while you were there. Value that choice and honor it, because that right there is where photography begins to mean something. I mentioned my mother already. She'd be turning in her bed if she knew I was showing this image to a large group of strangers. She turned 93 in May, and as you can see, she hasn't lost her appetite. Um, she still complains that she gets tired after 4 hours of gardening or an hour's walk through the woods. Um, she's where I get my values from, if I was to be perfectly honest with you. She never talks about productivity or success. She just gets on with life with grace, humor, and a quiet determination. She doesn't see what she does as remarkable, but it is. The fact that she can still drive a car without going off the road is quite remarkable. And these are the values that Expressive Photography is built on: showing up, doing the work, staying grounded, not chasing status or applause, but finding joy in the act itself. My mum doesn't do her garden for recognition. She gardens because she loves the earth between her fingers. And really, isn't that the essence of photography too? She talks at great length, if you allow her to, of all the years she spent climbing mountains in Scotland. We have a thing over here called Munros, which are mountains over a certain height, and there's 286 of them in Scotland. And she climbed them all. She finished them when she was 70 years old. This photograph was taken when she was 90. She'd climbed up to the hill above the village, a good hour's walk out of the village. And as you can see, she's quite short, but she is determined and endlessly curious, and happiest when there's a hill between her and the horizon. She doesn't move very fast, but she never stops. And that, I think, is a lesson in itself. It's not about conquering peaks or ticking lists. It's about joy, about being out there, part of the landscape, one step at a time. And honestly, if I've inherited even a fraction of that spirit, then maybe that's why I photograph the way I do, with persistence, with love, and I hope a little humility. So, photography. 15 years ago, I thought mastery would make me happy. I'd worked for about 10 years on technique, theory, and craft. And um, like many of us, I'd begun chasing perfection, the idea of perfection. And I believed that if I could just master the craft and win awards, gain recognition, I'd finally feel content. But I didn't. I felt very hollow. And the better I became technically, the further I actually drifted from myself. Um, and that really I realized was a pattern, not just in my photography, but in my life. Um, because art reflects life, if you hate your life, you'll hate your art. And if you chase approval, your art will only ever become performance. This image, the so-called pinnacle of my technical achievement, has everything maybe a competition judge back in 2014 or 2013 might have loved. Um, it's dramatic and, it's been processed up the yin yang, but it's not, it's clever, it's controlled, but it's quite dishonest. I actually call this image my zenith of shame. The sky is a replacement sky. It wasn't the one that was present at the time. A lot of the light was added in post-production. It's just not a very honest image. And it was just a product of the time. It's where photography was going. And unfortunately, it is still a big part of photography today. It's the Instagram social media mentality that the more dramatic something is, the more wows it gets from people that don't really know any better. And I cannot tell you how much I hate this photograph. I put it in there because it reminds me why I don't do it anymore. This is a newer photograph. This is the sun rising in Arctic Lapland, actually. I guess in Alberta you get trees that get covered in rime frost in the winter, and there's a place in Arctic Finland that happens too. And I was there with my wife, minus 36 degrees Celsius, which is pretty cold, and it gets lots of fog. So you get to make all of these really amazing photographs. And this is much more me, because no amount of external validation can fill an inner void. And this image wasn't about perfection, it's about survival. So it's worth giving you a bit of background. I don't know how much you guys know about me, but I lived with severe panic disorder and depression for over 30 years of my life, from the age of about 20 to 50, maybe a little more. So maybe more than that, actually, over 30 years, maybe 34, 35 years. Um, and I got back into photography in about 2001. And by the end of 2016, I was in a really dark place. The kind of place where you stop planning tomorrow because you can't really imagine getting through today. And, it's important for me to talk about these things because artists should talk about these things. And it's very much tells you the story of how I've ended up where I am today, which is not depressed, not panicky, very much better, to the point where I make my living trying to make other people better. So, no amount of external validation compensated for the well of self loathing that I existed in. I could win awards, sell prints, be applauded, but I couldn't stand being alone with myself. And yet somehow the camera was still there. It became a lifeline, not to escape reality, but to see it, to truly see it, to stand quietly in the landscape and feel, for the first time in years, that maybe I belonged somewhere. So the fact that I'm standing here today, or rather sitting in my living in my mother's kitchen, talking to you, is nothing short of a miracle. But this photograph, intimate, introspective, and honest, represents the moment I began to heal, not as a photographer, but as a person. I'm sure you have an infinite number of possibilities to photograph ice abstracts. I am jumping ahead a little, but yeah, so at the end of 2016, things were terrible. Things were so bad that in the beginning of January 2017, I ran away. As far away from the west coast of Scotland where I was living at the time. I actually lived on the Isle of Skye back then. I fled to the Gobi Desert and discovered two deeply profound insights. The first of which is you can't run away from yourself. Um, you can travel the world, you can climb mountains, win awards, but wherever you go too. And what I realized as soon as I got into the Gobi Desert and opened my camera bag was that I'd packed my anxious mind with me. As soon as I opened the bag, I leapt out and went, aha, you thought you could run away. So for years, I thought photography was an escape, a way to become someone else. That's what performance is being someone else. But what I eventually learned was that the camera doesn't let you escape yourself. It confronts you with yourself. And every time you raise it to your eye, it's a mirror. And that's what makes this craft so powerful. The camera isn't a machine for taking pictures, it's a device for seeing not just the world, but who you are within it. So for a long time, I thought darkness was failure, that struggle meant I was broken. But the truth is, darkness is part of the landscape. It's the shadow that defines the light. When you're lost, when you can't see the path, it doesn't mean the light isn't there. It's just hidden, waiting for you to become still enough to notice it. And that's what photography gave me, not a way to escape, but a way to see again. A way to recognize that even in the fog, even in the silence, light still exists. It's always enough to begin. So it was at that moment in the Gobi Desert at minus 36 degrees centigrade, hundreds of miles from the nearest road or home, I actually stopped trying to take photographs and started to receive them. There was a moment in the desert when everything fell away, ambition, frustration, even hope. And I realized the landscape wasn't something to capture, it was something to experience. That was my turning point. The camera became a tool to anchor my mind in the moment. There's a lot of talk about mindfulness, but all we need to do is nail our mind to now. So, understanding the landscape isn't analysis, it's empathy. The world understands, or the word understanding implies knowledge, but in truth, it's empathy. It's the act of standing beneath something, of supporting it with our awareness. Understanding the landscape means being in a conversation with it, creating a narrative, a dialogue, and listening with gratitude. This and the previous photograph are part of my Out of Darkness series, the book I published a couple of years ago. Horribly expensive to ship to Canada, but I think some of you may have bought it, which I'm truly grateful for. I sold a few when I was down at Shane Turgeon's Light Chasers conference down in Pincher Creek. I took some over in May. Maybe some of you were there. This is another photograph from the north coast of Spain, uh, somewhere I travel a lot. It's one of my favorite places in the world. The coast is remarkable and amazingly quiet. In the last 2 weeks, I think we saw about five other photographers, and all of them were on one beach. So every other beach we went to, there was no photographers. Um, every photograph is a self-portrait in disguise. When we stand before the land, what we really see is ourselves reflected back. Our state of mind, our level of awareness, our intent. The camera doesn't lie, it shows exactly who was behind it in that moment. Before we move into some of the practical things that I want to talk about this evening, I want to pause here because this is the hinge between seeing and expressing. If the landscape is a mirror, then photography is the language of that reflection. Every time we press the shutter, we're translating feeling into form. I really want you to hang on to these little snippets, and I'm going to repeat that one because if the landscape is a mirror, then photography is the language of that reflection. Every time we press the shutter, we're translating feeling into form. So let's take that short break. We've done about 40 minutes, um, and that might give people time to just have a short break. Does that work for you guys?
Yeah, that's great, Alister. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of in a trance right now, so I have to come out of the trance slowly. But we'll take 5 minutes and then reconvene. Everybody can refresh themselves.
Okay.
So, Alister, I'm going to suggest that we hold off on questions till the end because, and I'm just speaking for me, but I'm kind of in this real meditative mood with your soothing voice and approach, and I think answering
That's
questions might
fine.
sort of break
Sure,
the mood.
that's totally fine by me. That was my normal preferred way of doing things anyway. I kind of know that the narrative becomes like a story. So yeah, it's like breaking the story halfway through.
So, okay, so we'll start up in 1 minute then.
It took me years to figure this stuff out. It took me absolutely years. Um, yeah, I was just thinking while I was taking a break there that impressing somebody else is pointless if you're lying to yourself. And that's how I figured it. It's like if you're lying to yourself, impressing somebody else is pointless. So I think waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and thinking, I'm not that bad a guy. I actually quite like this guy. That's a lot better. Now I can go back to sleep at 3 o'clock in the morning instead of laying awake all night.
Fear and loathing in the Outer Hebrides.
Yeah, yeah, it's not a bad place to be alone. It's pretty well with my wife, of course. Yeah, we've just finished building a house. We've just moved in, so it's really great.
Okay, so let's resume. And for those who just came back to the screen, we're going to hold off on questions till the end because I think we're kind of getting into this meditative mood here, and I don't want to break it. So go ahead, Alistair.
Great. Okay, I'll do what I did before and turn off my camera and share my screen. And we should be where we left off. Okay, so that's where we left off. So when we translate um, experiences and connection and the outer landscape with the inner landscape, this translation doesn't happen by accident. It happens through relationships and through the way that light, contrast, color, geometry, and atmosphere invite us in. Basically, what happened was that I went into the Gobi Desert a complete wreck and was very confused with how to photograph this place. And I like to think I'm reasonably smart. And I sat down on the sand dune and thought about it. I thought, right, I can't think my way out of this. I'm going to have to just allow the landscape to invite me in. So I started just pointing my camera at things that were suggesting that I point my camera at them. I wasn't thinking about compositions. I wasn't thinking about winning awards. I wasn't thinking about writing a book. I just saw things that I thought were cool and pointed my camera at them. And when I got home, I started looking at this array of images. And in the end, I ended up going to the Gobi Desert 7 times over a 3 to 4 year period. And I ended up with about 1,600 photographs, which is not many. There was a guy in the workshop in Spain who shot 5,000 in one day. So 1,700 over 7 visits over a number of weeks didn't feel like a lot of images. But what happened was that I started to say, well, why did I think that was cool? So basically, this translation doesn't happen by accident. It happens through relationships, through the way that light, contrast, color, geometry, and atmosphere invite us in. These are not technical ingredients, they're emotional forces, the 5 elements of engagement. They are how we listen, how we respond, and ultimately how we express what it feels like to be alive in the world. These are expressive forces that shape every image. They're not technical checklists, but emotional triggers. Joy, tension, memory, structure, romance. When we learn to feel these, we stop photographing objects and start photographing relationships. So we'll look at each of these in detail, the 5 elements, and we'll start building a relationship with them. So luminosity is the joy of light. Luminosity is joy. It's not brightness, but the presence of energy. It's what pulls in the eye and also what lifts the heart. Lift your head from the screen right now and see the first thing that catches your eye. It's probably something bright. It's just the way our brains work. We are drawn to the light, and everyone is going to see that little waterfall tucked off on the lower right hand side there because it's white. It's just sitting there on the hillside. I really love this photograph. This is another drive-by shooting. I was literally driving up the glen, and this happened, and I just pulled off the road and took this shot with a long lens, handheld. Super simple, nothing complicated about it. Just reacting to the landscape, saying, "Come on, then, point your camera at this." I'll show various photographs through here that don't have any particular learning point to them other than they are a function of various elements: luminosity, contrast, atmosphere, color, geometry, etc. This photograph and the last photograph, the previous one was taken in the Highlands of Scotland in a foggy autumn morning, and this photograph was taken in one of the Canary Islands of West Africa on a foggy afternoon. Um, and the mood of them is very, very different. The darkness of this image gives a far more sinister and threatening feel to it than the other one, which was very bright and airy. And this one has a very different feel again. The little diamonds of water droplets on the tree at the background there, and then obviously the out of focus bokeh water droplets in the front because I'm using a shallow depth of field. Beautiful little atmospheric image, but very, very moody. This photograph was part of a series of images called Music from Dark Spaces, uh, taken in 2018 when I was still really quite depressed. Um, Only a matter of months before I wasn't depressed any longer. So it was quite a shift. We watched that color photograph of Mount Assiniboine earlier in this presentation. This is the black and white version, and I use it to illustrate contrast, which I call emotional friction. So contrast is where engagement happens. It's where things meet, light and dark, smooth and rough, emotion and stillness. It's tension that keeps the image alive. So luminosity relies on contrast, and contrast relies on luminosity and variations of it. And already we've found our first relationship, the battle of light and dark, the eternal struggle for our soul. This is a dark image, so it's the highlights that tell the story. And or is it the shadows that are telling the story? We have this contrast where it can either be a dark image with highlights or a bright mountain with deep shadow. There's two ways of looking at every image, and that is part of the mirror that we're holding up to ourselves. We can only see like us, we can only feel like us. Otherwise, we're just repeating what other people tell us is right or wrong. This is taken on the Isle of Harris. Again, I mentioned this is the island to the south of where we live, a vast expanse of open mud, which floods to a height of about 4 feet when the tide comes in. You can walk across at high tide if you're brave. This was taken at low tide with a 12 prime. That puddle in the front of the camera there can't be more than, I don't know, a meter across, if that, maybe only 80 centimeters. So it's really quite a small thing, but dropping a 12 prime on top of it made it look massive. Um, yeah, just again, the contrast of the texture in the foreground and the distance to the background gives a very strong sense of scale, and that sense of scale is a result of contrast. This a couple of trees that I was convinced were dead until the spring came round and they burst into leaf, bleached beyond compare. This isn't massively processed. This is just a weird photograph of two trees. The purpley ones are birch. We have a lot of those on the west coast of Scotland, and in the winter they get this really purple color. They are utterly stunning. And I do love them very, very much. And these are two big old oak trees, which I just don't understand why they can be so pale and burst into leaf every spring. It's really quite incongruous. The shape of them and the color of them is all about contrast and luminosity. The third of these emotional anchors that we have is color, which I believe triggers mood, memory, and meaning. So, color is the emotional language of photography. It's not just aesthetic, it's personal. Every hue carries memory, and every tone has its own history. Another image from Music from Dark Spaces, taken in a little woodland in Perthshire, where my mother still lives. I was running a retreat there in October of this year, which was fabulous. A proper slow photography with meditation and group discussions, and everyone had a blast. It was probably the best trip I think I've ever run. The emotional elements all weave together, working with each other in a symbiotic manner. They all contribute something. So in this image, the yellow leaves, we know it's fall. The mist, the fog, the way the beam is coming down through the fog like that. Everything in this image contributes to it. I can't stick a post-it note over something saying, "Don't look here." By the time you present an image, it is complete, or it should be complete. This is why critique is rarely anything more than opinion, because most photographers just say, "Well, I wouldn't do it like that. Do it my way, and then it's correct." That is not a critique, that is opinion. The fourth one is geometry, which is emotional gesture. So, geometry isn't about rules of composition, it's movement, energy, gesture, the way the eye is invited to dance through the frame. This is a really old trick in photography, is to use receding layers to give that impression of depth. There are only one, two, three, four, five tones in this whole image. Um, but we still know that the distant mountains are further away than the black silhouetted cliff. I made this the cover of the new ebook, uh, and it's one of my favorite photographs. I really, really like it just because it's so disgustingly simple. It's taken in the Yellow Mountains of China. I lived in China for 14 years with my previous career and as a photographer. Um, Atmosphere is the final of the emotional anchors that we have. And I think of it as the veil of feeling. So, atmosphere gives photography its romance. It softens edges and deepens emotion. Like memory itself, it blurs just enough to let imagination breathe. Atmosphere holds us in emotion. It's the stillness, the breath before the movement. But photography, like life, is never completely still. Between light and shadow, between air and earth, between what we feel and what we can describe, something begins to flow. And this thing that flows through a photograph are transitions. Transitions is the flow between things. So even though this photograph is all sand, another one of my Gobi images, the foreground and the background have a different feel to them, and there's a transition that goes from one to the other and then to the background. So in photography, everything lives at the edges, the lines between things. That's where movement, emotion, and meaning flow. Transitions are where the landscape breathes. Once you start looking at all these photographs and start thinking about the five elements, the five emotional anchors, luminosity, contrast, color, atmosphere, and geography, once you start looking at photographs and noticing those five things and the relationship between them, then suddenly you're actually composing by feel. The images are an arrangement of differences. And this is why interesting photographs tend to lead you on a bit of a journey. So transitions remind us that the world and us are always in motion. Nothing in the landscape truly stands still, and neither do we. Transitions are where the story lives, not in the peaks or in the valleys, but in the spaces between them. The edges of shadows, the shift in texture, the blur between water and rock. These are not boundaries, they're conversations. Everything in nature is moving, changing, becoming. The light turns, the tide pulls, the wind reshapes the land, and we are no different. We too are in the constant state of becoming, emotionally, creative, and spiritually. To photograph a transition is to honor impermanence, to recognize that beauty doesn't exist despite change, but because of it. It's a way of saying, I see this moment, brief, fragile, luminous, and I'm grateful for it. In a sense, every photograph is a transition from seeing to feeling, from chaos to clarity, from the outer landscape to the inner one. And this is where the idea of the visual compass begins, not as a tool for direction, but as a way of finding equilibrium within change. Finding your visual compass isn't about direction, it's about balance. It's not about knowing where you're going, but knowing where you are. This compass isn't designed to point north, it's meant to center you, to bring you back to awareness, a place of honesty and care. That's how we navigate as expressive photographers, not by chasing destinations, but returning to being present. When you're truly in balance, the noise of comparison falls away. Technique finds its purpose, intuition finds its rhythm, and the landscape begins to speak quietly, directly, without translation. Look at this image. Nothing shouts for attention. The shapes, tones, and textures breathe together, still poised, alive. The small pool of reflected light isn't the subject, it's the center of gravity. Um, that's what our inner compass helps us find. Not the most spectacular scene, but the place where everything within us comes into alignment. When we photograph from that space, our work stops being about what we saw and starts becoming who we are. Would it make sense to you if I told you that this image is called the dragon's eye? As soon as I saw that scene and raised my camera, I just thought that looks like the eye of a dragon. You can just imagine the head pointing to the right out of the frame. Um, and again, this is also on the Isle of Harris. Listening to silence. Um, when you're alone in nature, the noise of the world fades, and what's left is a kind of sacred quiet. The landscape doesn't ask you to perform. It doesn't care how skilled you are or what gear you have. It only asks you to listen. It doesn't care if you're an FRPS or if you're using a Fujifilm GFX 100 Mark II with the latest gadgets attached to it, or a really expensive tripod and an Arca Swiss C1 Cube geared head. It doesn't care. The landscape doesn't care any more than a golf course cares if you've bought a new set of golf clubs and you're still a 24 handicap. So stillness becomes the space where awareness grows, and that's where the compass steadies. This is where photography begins, not with a plan or a technique, but with a decision to notice. I talk a lot about having a sense of belonging in the landscape. And when you spend enough time there, the boundaries between you and it begin to dissolve. You stop taking pictures of the forest and begin making images with the forest. It's a partnership, a quiet conversation between two living things. This is where art and awareness merge, where you start to feel, not just to see. You realize you're not separate from nature, you're an expression of it, shaped by the same forces, moved by the same winds. That realization changes everything. It's no longer about capturing beauty, but participating in it. Many of you may know that I am a Zen practitioner. I have been doing so for since about 2007. And there's a really beautiful expression, which is the universe experiences itself through your senses. And I think that's what photography is. It's a way for us to appreciate the place that we live in connection with it. These trees dropping into a loch on the west coast of Scotland one autumn, just witnessing that and being there, I felt was a real honor. And being able to condense that into a scene, into a photograph, and share it with others, and just say, yeah, this is somewhere that we should be appreciating. Becoming the landscape is something else I talk a lot about. And these are moments in the field when everything falls away, the self, the noise, the striving, and all that remains is awareness itself. You're not thinking about the landscape anymore. You are the landscape. Every breath, every shift of light, every sound is mirrored inside you. This is the heart of expressive photography, not control, but surrender. The camera simply becomes a bridge between your inner stillness and the outer world. That is balance. That is the compass at rest. we spend so much time learning to read the world, light, weather, geography, but how often do we actually learn to read ourselves? It's every photograph we make is a trace of that inner weather, our mood, our energy, attention, and openness in the moment. When we're restless, our images scatter. When we're centered, they breathe. Understanding the landscape begins with understanding what we bring to it. I think it was Ansel Adams that said the most important person in every photograph is the 6 inches behind the camera. So we're so conditioned to looking outward to read the clues of light and form, to predict the weather, to master the craft. But how often do we pause long enough to ask, what am I actually bringing into this space? Every photograph is a mirror. It reflects not only the landscape, but the state of the person standing behind the camera. When I'm impatient, my compositions rush. When I'm anxious, my vision contracts. But when I'm calm, open, and connected, the landscape breathes through me. This is the quiet truth that anchors all my expressive photography. We don't photograph the world as it is, we photograph it as we are. This photograph was taken in northern Iceland. There's a waterfall called Dettifoss. Very famous, very beautiful little spot. And this was the bit that I thought really captured the rush and the energy of the place. Um, yeah, this is what photography is for me. We can't draw a map of the outer landscape until we've charted the contours of our own. Awareness of habit, motive, emotion, bias is the compass and the terrain. It tells us when we're chasing light and when we're listening to it. Every map begins with orientation, knowing where we stand. And in photography, that's not about GPS coordinates or sunrise times, it's about self location. Before we can read the landscape, we have to learn to read the subtle shifts within ourselves, our habits, our motives, our expectations. Because those are hidden, contours that shape every decision we make in the field, what draws our eye, what we dismiss, what we call beautiful. These are unique traits, what we call beautiful. You should be asking yourself that quite truly. I think being honest with ourselves is one of our greatest gifts that we can be. So, when I talk about awareness as both the compass and the terrain, I mean that our inner landscape isn't separate from the outer one, it's layered into it. Every moment in the field becomes an act of alignment between what the land offers and what we're ready to receive. There's a big difference between chasing light and listening to it. One comes from hunger, the need to capture and to claim, and the other comes from humility, the willingness to be guided. Luician rocks. We have some of the oldest rocks in the world on the island that I live on. In fact, where our house is built, the rocks are 3 billion years old, which are some of the oldest surface rocks in the world. And I never tire of photographing them, nor do I tire of photographing the flowing water that we have out here on the west coast of Scotland as well. So, this shift, as subtle as it may seem, is what transforms photography from our pursuit into a practice. The more we notice our internal rhythms, the more fluent we become in translating them through our craft. And that's the hidden work of expressive photography, decoding the unseen. To look at a finished image and say, ah, that's what I was feeling. That's where I was in myself. Not just when I pressed the shutter, but when I sat in front of the computer to articulate how I felt. And how we feel in front of the computer is often way more important than how we felt in the field. People ask me all the time how I feel in the field, and quite often I'm unable to tell them. I'm just there. I'm too present to think. And I think that's a good way to be. I don't want to be analyzing in the field. I don't want to be thinking about f-stops and apertures and exposure times and which filter I'm going to use. I don't want to think about any of that. I just want to embrace the landscape and be present. Another photograph from the Yellow Mountains of Eastern China. A stunning place. So it's not about getting bogged down with concepts of personal style or rules. It's about freedom. Uh, Many of you might recognize this place. It's the Old Man of Storr on the Isle of Skye. I've been there hundreds of times, and if you go there often enough, you eventually score some good weather. This was very serendipitous, taken right beside the road with a long lens, so nothing fancy again. Freedom is one of my favorite words in photography. All our maps, all our compasses, all our searching, they bring us back here to stillness, to presence, to relationship. In the end, the landscape doesn't need to be understood, only met. And the end of the journey is not mastery, it's belonging. So, understanding the landscape was never about control, it's about care. It's about meeting the world and yourself without an agenda. In my new book, I write that the world doesn't need more photographers, it needs more witnesses. It needs more people who are not there to capture and master. It needs more people to be there to collaborate and to educate others to the value that the landscape has. I'm sure in Alberta you have plenty of environmental challenges that can be documented and articulated through photography. So the true act of seeing isn't to possess, but to participate. And maybe that's the greatest gift of all, when the camera becomes not a tool for capture, but a bridge, a way to belong more deeply to this world and to yourself. This photograph was taken in February of this year. I was at the Fairy Pools, which is a super famous location on the Isle of Skye. I had a small workshop with me, and everyone wants to go to the Fairy Pools because of the pointy mountains and the waterfalls that fall down in front of them. And I was just obsessed with these ice patterns in the edge of the stream, and you can see little rainbow reflections along the edge there. Um, Really one that deserves to be seen better than over a Zoom connection. But I can assure you, you've got all these beautiful little rainbows along the edge there. It just drove me crazy. I was there for hours. Very, very happy boy. So, as I mentioned earlier, I wrote a book called Out of Darkness. It has 132 photographs that I took in the Gobi Desert, and it's an evolution from darkness into light. Bill Neal, or William Neal, wrote the foreword, and Joe Cornish wrote the other one. And really, from darkness to understanding has been a journey for me over two books. Out of Darkness was very much a love letter to healing. Uh, it was a process that I underwent where I suddenly changed everything about my life and saw myself in my life as a very different person. And it allowed me to be free. It allowed me not to be depressed, not to be anxious, not to be taking medication, not to be a shell of despair, but to be a contribution of joy and happiness and positivity. And that's really what my work is now, is to try and share that positive message that no matter how dark it might seem, it's really about just opening your eyes to the beauty that can exist even in darkness. So the new book, Understanding the Landscape, is very much a love letter to awareness, this growth of my awareness in terms of where I fit into photography and where photography fits with me, and how I can experience the world in a much more true way without being there to conquer it, without being there to be a master. Um, a friend of mine once wrote an article saying, Are you a hunter or a gardener?" And I think I'm definitely more into the gardening side of that mentality now. So, photography has given me everything. It's given me purpose, presence, and peace. My hope is that it continues to give you those things too, not as a pursuit of perfection, but as a way to belong, to understand, and to notice. Thank you for listening and sharing the path. If understanding the landscape speaks to you, it's probably because you're already listening. The last few slides were taken in Morocco. Again, I've been running some workshops there into the Sahara Desert, and this particular slide was taken in a canyon just on the outskirts of the Sahara Desert, and it it's me playing games. It's how minimalistic can I make a photograph. So thank you for listening. I appreciate your time. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions, if any, that you may have.
Wow. Thanks so much, Alister. That was absolutely beautiful. Um, I'll just make the one observation, then then I'll open it up for everybody to ask questions. But it's interesting because your approach or your philosophy echoes a lot of other ones that I've been listening to and the ones that resonate with me. This past week we had Charles Needle from Colorado address our club. Last year we had Adam Gibbs. We've had Cole Thompson. And these are all world-renowned photographers, but they, like you, they set aside the technical details and the widgets and the wow factor and the seeking of attention and applause, and they promote the idea of discovering your own vision, of not worrying about what other people think of your images, but be true to yourself, and that really resonates to me. And I find it beautiful. So I'll just open it up so people, you can just unmute yourself and pose a question or raise a hand perhaps so that we know. So I see John has his hand up, so John, go ahead. You there, John? You're muted. Okay. Oh, anybody else, anybody then just unmute yourself and pose a question.
This is common after I've given a talk. People just go, what was
So,
that all about?
so I'll start because lots of us come from a background of something else other than photography. And I think many of us are trying to accomplish what you are talking about. But first you have to learn the craft. Is that not true? Or what do you do in the middle?
Yeah, you can't divorce craft from photography. The old expression is photography is a marriage of art and craft. And it's the same with anything. I mean, I'm a guitar player and learning how to tune your instrument, understanding what basic chords are, understanding how chords are created, understanding how you can create a melody from chords. All of this kind of theoretical stuff is useful. It's not necessary, but it's helpful. And there's an expression I used in the presentation, which is you need the amount of technique necessary to express yourself. And I know some incredibly expressive photographers who are not the least bit technical. Now, classical landscape photography, like the photograph behind you, for example, where you have foreground, midground, background, depth, three-dimensionality, exposure differences to overcome. All of those things require a certain amount of technical knowledge. This photograph behind me is a 7-minute exposure at night. It's a technical thing. You don't just work that stuff out by accident. So I think what's important is balance. I think if you throw all of your learning into craft and it's technique without purpose, whereas if you don't learn any technique but you're really expressive, you might find that you're not articulating yourself particularly well because people don't understand what you're trying to say. And I think it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. Um, but at some point, I think you have to ask the question, why am I making photographs? What am I trying to articulate? And some of that, if you're honest, and I'm not saying you, there's no
Yeah, yeah.
victim. I'm not targeting you in my response particularly. If one answers that question, my previous career, I was in international finance. I used to fly all over the world and sit in boardrooms and have big, high-level discussions with people with lots of money. And I had the ego to go with that career. You have to have an ego in those t lines of work, otherwise, you just don't exist in that type of environment. And when it came to photography, I wanted to win. I wanted to be successful. I wanted to be recognized as being a good, competent photographer. I wanted to be a photographer's photographer. I wanted my peers to recognize that. And this is maybe 20 years ago when I was focused on that type of goal-oriented, achievement-oriented photography. And I answered the question, why am I doing this? And I thought, well, I want people to like me. I want people to think I'm good. And it was my ego that was driving that. And now, it's not that I don't care what people think of my work, because I do. I like it when people say nice things about my work, but it's not important to me. I don't need other people to tell me that they think it's good or bad for that matter. Um, so in answer, the first question you asked is how, learning technique, learning how the medium works is important. But there's not that much to learn. I think it's a finite amount. I think there's less to learn than we think there is, even though it seems that there's something new to learn every day.
You speak to me very loudly because I guess where I came from, personal finance. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Same sort of drive, same sort of obstacles to overcome. And here we are.
Yeah, yeah. So I think the problem we have is that in the 25 years that I've been involved in the contemporary photography scene, it's changed beyond recognition. Digital has become the norm. Um, Social media has become the way we share images rather than books and prints. And one of the reasons I did my book was I wanted to have a physical book, that people could own, because it's real then, and it's
Mhm.
exactly how I wanted to present the work. When you hold the print in your hand, that is what it's supposed to look like, not like on your phone. So I think it's the world doesn't need more photographs, but people need more meaning. And I think this is the angle that I've decided to come from, is saying, yeah, being competent is good, but self-actualizing is more important. Feeling good about ourselves doing what we're doing is a good thing. I've changed my relationship with the guitar to the extent that I'm a far better guitar player in the last 5 years than I've made progress in the previous 30 years. So it's
Mhm.
crazy how quickly you can change your relationship with something and everything changes. So it's about honesty and feeling fulfilled rather than, like I said, in the interlude there, when we had that little break, impressing somebody else and feeling like a liar. I can't think of something worse than that. Feeling honest about myself and people don't understand my work, I can live with that.
It speaks to me, Alister. Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Somebody's asked the question about what drove you to pick the Gobi Desert for your getaway.
It was as far away from the Isle of Skye as I could go. My ex-wife was Chinese, and she'd researched on how to get in there. It's an area of China that the Chinese don't really want you to go. They crash their satellites into it. Um, and you find bits of these crashed satellites out in the Gobi quite a lot. And it's not just satellites, it's like military stuff. And they don't want you there at all. Um, but it's hundreds of miles from the nearest road. I mean, you're out in the dunes and you're camping out there and stuff. I'd never really photographed deserts before. We spent a month out in Xinjiang province, flew way out west to a town called Urumqi, um, and traveled along the Silk Road and down into, there's a thing called the Taklan Depression, I think it was called, or some Taklan or something like that. And then we ended up in the Gobi and with this driver who took us up there. So yeah, it was really my ex-wife. She'd researched this area and had spoken to some Chinese photographers who'd been in there, but I think I was the first foreigner to go in there, foreigner in the Chinese sense of the word.
Yeah, okay. If anybody has a question, like I say, just unmute yourself and ask away. I'm not,
There must be a hockey game on.
I'm not hearing any questions, so maybe we'll just call it a day then, Alistair. I think speaking for myself, well, actually, I think I speak for many on the call here that you've challenged us to rethink our approach to photography, and in a good way.
For sure.
And I'll have to resonate on this, on your, or ruminate, I guess, on your messages. There's lots of positive comments in the chat. I don't know if you've seen them or not, but people are very
No,
appreciative of what you
no,
have to say.
I hadn't got around to that. What do you have in your camera bag? Do you have a favorite lens that you find yourself using more than others? I have a Fuji GFX 100 Mark II. I've got a 20 to 35, a 45 to 100, and a 100 to 200, and I've got a 500 prime. Um, I probably shoot the 100 to 200 more than anything, but I do love the 500 prime. Having the effective focal length of 400 mil on a medium format camera with 102 megapixels is awesome. Um, what's they say? The best camera is the one you've got with you.
Steve, this is Vinod. I have a question for Alister. Hello, Alister. Um,
Hi.
my question is, your images are stunning, and I wonder if there is any post-processing that happens with your images, because uh, I'm not sure if they come out of the camera the way you show them, and if they do, then that's just amazing. And I guess that's many years of work that reflected in the images.
Well, thank you for your kind words. I think it depends on the image. Processing for me, I grew up in the as a photographer. I was part of that wave of photographers who were involved very early on with luminosity masks. You know, Tony Kuiper and Sean Bagshaw, both friends of mine. And during the kind of mid 2000s, 2006, 7, 8, there was a big push to overcome the limitations of the medium. So if anyone's ever shot Velvia, you know that when you point Velvia at a landscape, it doesn't come back looking anything like the landscape that you're photographing. Very limited dynamic range. It deals with colors in quite an aggressive way, you know, reds and greens and blues. Very primary in its presentation. And I had shot Velvia as a young man, and I still shoot Velvia with a Hasselblad film camera. So processing for me became about, well, how can we make photographs look more real? You know, how can we make them look more like the scenes that we're witnessing? And most of that was done with blending, so exposure blending. And it got to the stage that to do it well, so that photograph I showed earlier that I called my Zenith of Shame, that was probably about 15 hours of processing to get that image looking like that. So it became horribly time consuming. And I'm very good friends with Mark Adamus, who I'm sure most of you know. And Mark will spend 20 hours processing an image. And I just don't want to do that anymore. So the images in my book in Out of Darkness, most of them are only a couple of minutes. You know, very, very small corrections. I spent more time removing sensor spots from those images than I spent processing them. Just to make sure, printing a book and finding a sensor spot was my idea of a living hell. So I would say most of my photographs now come out the camera really close. Now I don't want that to become a mantra. You know, Alister Benn says, get it right in camera. You know, I'm not, that's not what I'm saying. It's just the things that I photograph. Because I point my camera at things that exist. I point my camera at relationships that are presenting themselves. And if I over process the image, then I actually kill the thing that I was photographing in the first place. So I do try and make something come out of the camera looking pretty good, but requiring not too much processing. So I would say the maximum I spend processing these days is probably no more than 5 minutes, if that.
Go ahead, Wendy.
Thank you for that.
No worries. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi,
Um,
Wendy.
Hi, your presentation, oh, very inspiring. And I'm I took photography in grade 10, and I've just started to kind of want to do more. So I've been walking around. My brother gave me his digital SLR, and I've been using autofocus and auto everything because I just want to do what you're saying, like just kind of see what resonates with me and kind of let the camera do the work. So I am, I've joined the local club, but and I want to learn more technique. But um, with everything in life, you feel bogged down with so many details sometimes, and I feel like just spending more time on the automated version of the camera and capturing what I like to see. But any recommendations like moving forward where maybe I don't want to do a super deep dive, but I want to, yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, right. Well, thanks for that. And I think you probably know the answer to that yourself, that, you know, you feel comfortable not having to think too much about the technical and more about the artistic side of things, perhaps. Um, I respond way more to photographs made with feel than with craft. You know, well crafted images that are boring are not as good as poorly crafted images that are interesting. Would be my way of thinking about it, I guess. Now, I refer you back to that thing I said earlier. You need the amount of technique you need to express yourself. If you can express yourself with hardly any technique and you feel good about it, the thing about it is we're all different. Each one of us in this call is a unique person who only sees the world through our eyes. Nobody else knows what's in our head. Nobody else really can understand what it's like to be us. And the danger of listening to other people's advice is that it's what works for them and it may well not work for you. And this is one of the fundamental problems with education is they try and make everybody learn the same way, and not everyone responds to that. So I think you need to find a teacher who can speak a language that resonates with you. So you know, the problem with a lot of teaching is it's very technical. Where when I teach, I don't use technical language, I tend to use emotional language. So I'll talk about depth and feeling rather than talking about shutter speeds or apertures. You know, control when you have a clear intention is very useful. You know, understanding how to shoot something with a shallow depth of field because it makes it more atmospheric rather than everything being at f16 and sharp front to back, and understanding how to allow things that are moving to move rather than freezing them solid. You know, think of a waterfall shot at a 5,000th of a second versus a waterfall photographed at half a second. They look completely different. So I think, yeah, you know, approaching technique from the angle that you want it to serve your articulation of your voice is way more valuable than learning technique just for the sake of learning technique. I was a horribly technical photographer. I learned it because I was a geek. You know, I listened to Rush, I listened to prog, I play guitar in 7/8. You know,
Yeah,
every time signature except 4/4. You know, so you know, I grew up with that kind of geeky mindset, and I did astrophysics at university, and you know, all of those things kind of led me down that avenue until I had this great epiphany of understanding that emotion was more important than technique, really, I think. So go with your heart, I think, is the best place to go. You know, it's I think the danger is that you you get your own intuition gets drowned out by other people's desire for you to do it the way that they think is the right way for you to do it. So I'd be stubborn. No
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much.
worries.
Okay, any other questions? Sort of last chance here. Oh, yeah. Well, hearing none, so let's call it a day. Thank you very much on behalf of the group, Alistair. It was
No
awesome.
worries. No, thank you. And what, nearly quarter to 11 at night here, and I'm quite amazed I'm still awake. So it's obviously been quite interesting for me too. The ebook is available on the website. Um, it's always a great privilege to speak to a good group of people like yourselves. And if anyone's interested in the book, then I'd be delighted if any of you would check that out.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alistair.
Thanks, Alan.
Have a good
Great.
evening.
Thank you very much. I'm going straight to bed.
Sleep well. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.